how, if there are politically conscious leaders inside the labor movement, the impact and the effect they can have on that movement, even if not on the movement as a whole, on the movement in one area, one region. And that is, of course, extremely important. In Britain, where I live, the trade union leadership completely capitulated to Tony Blair when he decided to go to war and back Bush. The rank and file were against the war. There were lots of resolutions calling on the trade union leaders to break with Blair, and they had the votes to defeat Blair at the Labour Party conference, but in return for tiny, pathetic promises, a few crumbs here and there, they held back and refused to vote with the tiny handful of people who voted against the war in the Labour Party. So it depends on who is running these unions and what the extent of rank and file pressure is. I think the only thing that happened in Britain, nothing on the level of the West Coast in the United States, was two railway workers from the Railway Workers Union, the Royal Maritime Trades, RMT, train drivers refused to drive a train carrying weapons and cargo from Scotland to be shipped to Iraq. And it had a big impact when they did it, but the union didn't have the support, didn't do anything to back them up. They could, in fact, have called a limited 48-hour strike of all trains carrying any weapons and said, we are not going to do it, and that would have had a big, big impact, especially as a large part of the British population was hostile to that war. So it wasn't even a question of doing something crazy and being isolated from the population. It would have chimed in extremely well with the anti-war mood in Britain, as in Canada, as in the United States, where the figures were less, but you had very big demonstrations in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles against the war in Iraq. And the question we then have to ask is, how come all over the world millions of people came out to try and stop that war? What happened to them the day after? Or the month after? Or the year after? And the answer is this, that these were not demonstrations organized by the left or by progressives who formed, basically a network to organize the demonstration, but that the millions who came out were ordinary citizens of these countries, extremely upset at the thought that they were going to war, and knowing instinctively that their politicians were lying to them. People knew they were lies right from the beginning. And they came out to protest the lies and the war. But once the war happened, because they weren't organized, because they weren't part of the labor movement, because they weren't part of large political formations, but had come out essentially as individuals on one day, they got demoralized in many cases and went back home, saying we can't do anything. So the millions suddenly who had played such an important role disempowered themselves. And that is a lesson we have to learn as well in the future when these mobilizations are organized. Of course, the best possible mobilization would have been a general strike against the war, a global general strike against the war, to stop anything from functioning, as long as the politicians and their backers were going to war. But that didn't happen. Now, two other things I want to say, that there is a long history and tradition of effective protests. Yesterday I spoke about the anti-Vietnam protests, and as I said, that was linked very directly to the fact that you had conscription in the United States, which democratized the protests, since every single American family knew that they could be hit unless their names were Bush. But and that's exactly what made the anti-war mood in the United States once it became clear that the war was being lost, that lives were being lost, American lives. Not many people cared about Vietnamese lives except one wing of the anti-war movement, but by and large, that American lives were being lost and this war could not be won. And by the way, that is the same situation now in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Everyone knows that these wars cannot be won, and the American intelligence agency knows that these wars cannot be won, but there is no conscription in the United States, so a lot of people can stay and remain aloof. So the Vietnam movement was a historic movement, especially the movement in the United States and the movement in the GIs. I mean, the black GIs, you know, in the riots that took place in '68 for civil rights, essentially, and for the right to live and work decently, it was well known that a lot of the snipers were former veterans who had served in Vietnam. Blacks who had been promised a better life when they came back and came back to the same old shit, essentially. And that's what they confronted, and that's when they fought. And that's when they resisted. I remember being at a big anti-war demonstration in Berlin in February '68, when there were 3 former black GIs who appeared on the platform, and the famous slogan of the time, "Hell no, we ain't gonna go. I ain't gonna go to Vietnam because Vietnam is where I am." Linking the war to conditions in the ghettos in the United States of America. And that's what made that movement effective. Secondly, there were other movements. As Clarence mentioned already, the movement against apartheid in South Africa. Here, once again, the United States played a very big role. The anti-apartheid movement, the campaigns for disinvestment within the labor movement on campuses were very effective. In Britain, there was a similar movement, but not as big. But one symbolic thing, which was that every single day in the last 5 years of apartheid, there was a picket outside the South African embassy. And the people organizing the picket of the embassy said, as long as apartheid exists in South Africa, whether there are 10 of us, or whether there are 50, or whether there are 100, there will be a picket outside this embassy. And then, of course, the campaigns described by Clarence against apartheid, and then the most amazing act of solidarity shown, which really played a very big part in bringing down the apartheid regime, the decision of Fidel Castro and the Cuban leadership to send Cuban troops thousands of miles away to Angola once the South African army had entered Angola, and to inflict a bloody and crushing defeat on the army of apartheid. And that created a totally new mood. And one of the first trips Nelson Mandela made was to Havana. I bet it wasn't that widely reported here. I mean, in the United States and North America generally, it wasn't so well reported. But one of the first foreign trips he made was to Havana to publicly thank Fidel Castro. And he said, what you did and the solidarity you demonstrated was the final nail in the coffin of the apartheid system, because they had been defeated by a multiracial army. Many of the Cuban soldiers who fought were Afro-Cubans. And the fact that they had played a leading role, quite deliberately sent, by the way, precisely to show the white leaders of South Africa, we are the ones who are going to defeat you. And Fidel, in his speech, I'll never forget, said, we owe a blood debt to Africa, because many of the Afro-Cubans in our country came here as slaves to work the plantations. And they were dragged from their countries and put on ships and brought here and exploited and cruelly treated. And so we have liberated them, made them equal citizens, and they are going back to Africa together with many of us, to pay back that debt to Africa. And that had a phenomenal resonance. So there are different forms of solidarity and different ways of struggle globally. I mean, I often say to myself that why is it that Latin Americans, South American, the poor of South America, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Peru, came out and defeated plans to privatize, which the big so-called powerful trade unions in the Western world in most cases couldn't do. But the Peruvian peasants fought for 3 months against the army to stop the electricity privatization. And I remember I was in Caracas at that time seeing a Peruvian peasant, not organized, just a peasant, saying on television, they were asking him on South American CNN, why are you people violent? Why are you fighting? And this Peruvian peasant stood up and said, you know, I'm not educated. I don't read many books. I'm not an intellectual. I don't belong to any other. One thing I know, that whenever something is privatized, we suffer. And he said, I know what will happen if the electricity is privatized. It won't affect you guys in the towns all that much unless you happen to be poor, he said to the television journalist. But within 3 months of privatization, we will have no electricity in our villages in the mountains. And we will be returning to use oil lamps. That's why we are fighting. In Bolivia, when they privatized the water supplies and sold them to Bechtel, a US corporation, and Bechtel got the government to pass a law in Cochabamba that it was illegal for people to collect rainwater in their receptacles on the roofs. They passed this law, and then they were surprised when there was an insurrection. And people came out onto the streets of Cochabamba, and they killed a few. And then the entire town came out, and what happened? The government panicked, the law was reversed, Bechtel was chucked out, and the municipality of Cochabamba regained control of that water. And in Venezuela, the big movement against the IMF finally resulted in the creation of the Bolivarians and Chavez's victories, which are not understandable unless you see what happened when a supposedly progressive government implemented IMF rules, cancelled subsidies to the poor, cancelled transport subsidies, and when the people resisted in the famous Caracazo of 1989, nearly 10 years before Seattle. That was the first big movement against the Washington Consensus, and the new globalization was in Caracas. 3,000 people were shot dead by the army. Barely reported. 3,000 poor people were shot dead for coming out onto the streets to protest against the IMF. That is what created study circles and groups inside the army of young officers and soldiers who said the army is created to defend a country, not to shoot its own people. That was what brought Chavez to prominence. So we have that continent, a continent of hope, where mass struggles have produced political leaders who have pledged to the mass movements to carry out their demands and have begun to do so. And that is the model we require for the West as well. That is the model. So there is no one particular form of solidarity because conditions differ from country to country, from continent to continent. But one principle, which Clarence has already enunciated, an injury to one is an injury to all, has been understood by many people who aren't even organized in anything, leave alone labor movement or trade unions or political parties. They are unorganized, but this they have understood. And that is why they have come out. And that is why we have to learn from a diverse and varying group of people